So we're gonna read this out loud. Whenever I find it. Yes. Where was I? All right. So they have our main character, Chris, Kelvin, and he's hooked up to wires and shit, metal all over his head. They're gonna track his brain, and then they're gonna like use the information and shoot it into the fucking ocean, I think, to see what happens. I believe they need it. I don't know why they just don't use their own fucking heads, but they want to use Chris and do something. Maybe it'll help him create an electromagnetic field that'll disrupt the ocean entity. Anyway, let's continue. Let's read Solaris by Stanislaw Lem. Ready, Chris? He was leaning with one elbow on the control panel of his electroencephalograph, looking completely relaxed. His confident tone reassured me, and I was grateful to him for calling me by my first name. Let's get started. I closed my eyes. A sudden panic had overwhelmed me after Snow had fixed the electrodes and walked over to the controls. Now it disappeared just as suddenly. Though half-closed lids, I could see the red lights winking on the back control panel. I was no longer aware of the damp, unpleasant touch of the crown of clammy electrodes. My mind was an empty gray arena ringed by a crowd of invisible onlookers, massed on tiers of seats, attentive, silent, and emanating in their silence an ironic contempt for Sartorius and the mission. What should I improvise for these spectators? Rhea. I introduced her names cautiously, ready to withdraw at once, but no protest came, and I kept going. I was drunk with grief and tenderness, ready to suffer prolonged sacrifices patiently. My mind was pervaded with Rhea, without a body or a face, but alive inside me, real and imperceptible. Suddenly, as if printed over that despairing presence, I saw in the gray shadow the learned professorial face of Gies, the father of Solaris studies, and of Solaris. I was now visualizing the nauseating mud eruption which had swallowed up the gold-rimmed spectacles and carefully brushed mustache. I was seeing the engraving on the title page of his classic work and the close-hatched strokes against which the artist had made his head stand out. So, like my father's, that head, not in its features but in its expression of old-fashioned wisdom and honesty, that I was finally no longer able to tell which of them was looking at me, my father or Gies. They were dead, and neither of them buried. But when deaths without burial are not uncommon in our time, the image of Gies vanished, and I momentarily forgot the station, the experiment, Rhea in the ocean. Recent memories were obliterated by the overwhelming conviction that these two men, my father and Gies, nothing but ashes now, had once faced up the totality of their existence, and this conviction afforded a profound calm which annihilated the formless assembly clustered around the gray area had once now faced the totality of their existence, and this conviction afforded a profound calm which annihilated the formless assembly clustered around the gray arena in the expectation of my defeat. I heard the click of circuit breakers and light penetrated my eyelids, which blinked open. Sartorius had not budged from his previous position and was looking at me. Snow had his back turned to operate the control panel. I had the impression that he was amusing himself by making his sandals slap on the floor. "Do you think that stage 1 has been successful, Dr. Kelvin?" Sartorius inquired in the nasal voice which I had come to detest. "Yes. Are you sure?" He persisted, obviously rather surprised and perhaps even suspicious. "Yes." My assurance and the bluntness of my answers made him lose his composure briefly. "Oh, Good, he stammered. Snow came over to me and started to unwrap the bandage from my head. Sartorius stepped back, hesitated, then disappeared into the dark room. I was rubbing the circulation back into my legs when he came out again, holding the developed film. Zigzag lines traced a lacy pattern along 50 feet of glistening black ribbon. Wait. My presence was no longer necessary, but I stayed, and Snow fed the ribbon into the modulator. Sartorius made a final suspicious examination of the last few feet of the spool, as if trying to decipher the content of the wavering lines. The experiment proceeded with a minimum of fuss. Snow and Sartorius each sat a bank of controls and pushed buttons. Through the reinforced floor, I heard the whine of power building up in the turbines. Lights moved downward inside glass-fronted indicators in time with the descent of the great X-ray beamer to the bottom of its housing. They came to a stop at the low limit of the indicators. Snow stepped up the power, and the white needle of the voltmeter described a left-to-right semicircle. The hum of current was barely audible now. As the film unwound, invisible behind the two round caps, numbers clicked through the footage indicator. I went over to Rhea, who was watching us over her book. She glanced up at me inquiringly. The experiment was over, and Sartorius was walking towards the heavy conical head of the machine. "Can we go?" Rhea mouthed silently. I replied with a nod. Rhea stood up, and we left the room without taking leave of my colleagues. A superb sunset was blazing through the windows of the upper deck corridor. Usually the horizon was reddish and gloomy at this hour. This time it was a shimmering pink, laced with silver. Under the soft glow of the light, the somber foothills of the ocean shone pale violet. The sky was red, only at the zenith. We came to the bottom of the stairway, and I stopped, reluctant to wall myself up again in the prison cell of the cabin. "Rhea, I want to look something up in the library. Do you mind?" "Of course not," she exclaimed. In a forced attempt at cheerfulness, I confined myself to read. I knew only too well that a gulf had opened between us since the previous day. I confined myself to read. I knew only too well that a gulf had opened between us since the previous day. I should have behaved. We walked down the ramp leading to the library. There were 3 doors giving onto the little entrance hall, and crystal globes containing flowers were spaced out along the walls. I opened the middle door, which was lined with synthetic leather on either side. I always avoided contact with this upholstery when entering the library. We were greeted by a pleasant gust of fresh air, in spite of the stylized sun painted on the ceiling. The great circular hall had remained cool. Idly running a finger along the spines of the books, I was on the point of choosing, out of all the Solaris classics, the first volume of Geese, so as to refresh my memory of the portrait on the title page, when I came upon a book I had not noticed before, an octavo volume with a cracked binding. It was Gravinsky's compendium, used mostly by students as a crib. Sitting in an armchair with Rhea at my side, I leafed through Gravinsky's alphabetical classification of the various Solaris theories. The compiler, who had never set foot on Solaris, had combed through every monograph, expedition report, fragmentary outline, and provisional accounts, even making excerpts of incidental comments about Solaris in plain theological works dealing with other worlds. He had drawn up an inventory crammed with simplistic formulations which grossly diminished the subtlety of the ideas they resumed. Originally intended as an all-embracing account, Gravinsky's book was little more than a curiosity now. It had only been published 20 years before, but since that time such a mass of new theories had accumulated that there would not have been room for them in a single volume. I glanced through the index, practically an obituary list, for few of the authors cited were still alive, and among the survivors none was still playing an active part in Solaris studies. Reading all these names and adding up the sum of the intellectual efforts they represented in every field of research, it was tempting to think that surely one of the theories quoted must be correct, and that the thousands of listed hypotheses must each contain some grain of truth, could not be totally unrelated to the reality. In his introduction, Gravinsky divided the first 60 years of Solaris studies into periods. During the initial period, which began with the scouting ship that studied the planet from orbit, nobody had produced theories in the strict sense. Common sense suggested that the ocean was a lifeless chemical conglomerate, a gelatinous mass which through its quasi-volcanic activity produced marvelous creations and stabilized its eccentric orbit by virtue of a self-generated mechanical process, as a pendulum keeps itself on a fixed path once it is set in motion. To be precise, Maginot had come up with the idea that the colloidal machine was alive 3 years after the first expedition, but according to the compendium, the period of biological hypothesis does not begin until 9 years later, when Maginot's idea had acquired numerous supporters. The following years teemed with theoretical accounts of the living ocean, extremely complex and supported by mathematical analysis. During the third period, scientific opinion, up until now practically unanimous, became divided. What followed was internecine warfare between scores of new schools of thought. It was the age of Panmuller, Strobel, Freyes, Legros, and Osipowicz. The entire legacy of Gies was submitted to a merciless examination. The first atlases and inventories appeared, and new techniques in remote control enabled instruments to transmit stereo photographs from the interior of the asymmetriads. What? Once considered impossible to explore. In the hubbub of controversy, the minimal hypotheses were contemptuously dismissed, even if the long-awaited contact with the reasoning monster did not materialize. It was argued that it was still worth investigating the cartilaginous cities of the Mimoids and the ballooning mountains that rose above the ocean, because we would gain valuable chemical and physiochemical information, and enlarge our understanding of the structure of giant molecules. Nobody bothered even to refute the adherence of this defeatist line of reasoning. Scientists devoted themselves to drawing up catalogs of the typical metamorphoses, which are still standard works, and Frank developed his bioplasmatic theory of the Mimoids, which has since been shown to be inaccurate, but remains a superb example of intellectual audacity and logical construction. The 30 or so years of the first three Gravinsky, with their open assurance, periods with their open assurance and irresistibly optimistic romanticism, constitute the infancy of Solaris studies. Already a growing skepticism heralded the age of maturity. Towards the end of the first quarter century, the early colloido-mechanistic theories had found a distant descendant in the concept of the apsychic ocean. A new and almost unanimous orthodoxy which threw overboard the view of that entire generation of scientists who believed that their observations were evidence of a conscious will, teleological processes, and activity motivated by some inner need of the ocean. This point of view was now overwhelmingly repudiated, and the ground was cleared for the team headed by Holden. Ionides and Stoliva, whose lucid, analytically based speculations concentrated on scrupulous examination of a growing body of data. It was the golden age of the archivists. Microfilm libraries burst at the seams with documents. Expeditions, some of them more than 1,000 strong, were equipped with the most lavish apparatus Earth could provide. Robot recorders, sonar and radar in the entire range of spectrometers, radiation counters, and so on. Material was being accumulated at an accelerating tempo, but the essential spirit of the research flagged, and in the course of this period, still an optimistic one, in spite of everything, a decline sets in. The first phase of Solaris had been shaped by the personality of men like Geese, Strobel and Sevada, who had remained adventurous whether they were asserting or attacking a theoretical position. Sevada, the last of the great Solarists, disappeared near the south pole of the planet, and his death was never satisfactorily explained. He fell victim to a mistake which not even a novice would have made. Flying at low altitude in full view of scores of observers, his aircraft had plunged into the interior of the Agilus, which was not even directly in its path. There was speculation about a sudden heart attack or fainting fit or a mechanical failure, but I have always believed that this was in fact the first suicide, brought on by the first abrupt crisis of despair. There were other crises, not mentioning Gravinsky, whose details I was able to fill in out of my own knowledge as I stared at the yellowed, closely printed pages. The later expressions of despair were in any case less dramatic. Just as outstanding personalities became rare, the recruitment of scientists to any particular field of study in a given age has never been studied as a phenomenon in its own right. Every generation throws up a fairly constant number of brilliant and determined men. The only difference lies in the direction they choose to take. The absence or presence of such individuals in a particular field of study is probably explicable in terms of the new perspectives offered. Opinions may differ about the researches of the classical age of Solaris studies, but nobody can deny their stature, even their genius. For several decades, the mysterious ocean had attracted the best mathematicians and physicists, and the top specialists in biophysics, information theory, and electrophysiology. Now, without warning, the army of researchers found itself leaderless. There remained a faceless mass of industrious collectors and compilers. The occasional original experiment might be devised, but the succession of vast expeditions mounted on a world scale petered out, and the scientific world no longer echoed with ambitious, controversial theories. Let me start a little flash goal. The machinery of Solaris fell into disrepair and rested over the hypotheses differentiated only in minor details and unanimous in their concentration on the theme of the ocean's degeneration, regression, and introversion. Now and then a bolder, more interesting concept might emerge, but it always amounted to a kind of indictment of the ocean, viewed as the end product of a development which long ago, thousands of years before, had gone through a phase of superior organization and now had nothing more than a physical unity. The argument went that its many uses, absurd creations, were its death heroes, throes, impressive enough nonetheless, which had been going on for centuries. Thus, for instance, the extensors and mimoids were seen as tumors in all the surface processes of the huge fluid body as expressions of chaos and anarchy. This approach to the problem became an obsession. For 7 or 8 years, the academic literature produced a spate of assertions which, although framed in polite, cautious terms, amounted to little more than insults. The revenge of a rabble of leaderless suitors when they realized that the object of their most pressing attentions was indifferent to the point of obstinately ignoring all their advances. A group of European psychologists once carried out a public opinion poll spread over a period of several years. Their report had no direct bearing on Solaris studies and was not included in the library collection, but I had read it and retained a clear memory of its findings. The investigators had strikingly demonstrated that the changes in lay opinion were closely correlated to the fluctuations of opinions recorded in scientific circles. I'm getting tired. I had 2 cups of coffee and it didn't work. I'm tired. The change was expressed even in the coordinating committee of the Institute of Plantology, which controls the financial appropriations for research by means of a progressive reduction in the budgets of institutes and appointments devoted to Solaris studies, as well as by restrictions on the size of the exploration teams. Some scientists adopt a position on the other extreme and agitated for more vigorous steps to be taken. The administrative director of the Universal Cosmological Institute ventured to assert that the living ocean did not despise men in the least, but had not noticed them, as an elephant neither feels nor sees the ants crawling on its back. To attract and hold the ocean's attention, it would be necessary to devise more powerful stimuli and gigantic machines tailored to the dimensions of the entire planet. That's smart. Malicious commentators were not slow to point out that the director could well afford to be generous, since it was the Institute of Plantology that would have had to foot the bill. Still, the hypothesis rained down old, resurrected hypotheses, superficially modified, simplified, or complicated to the extreme, and solaristics, a relatively well-defined discipline in spite of its scope, became an increasingly tangled maze where every apparent exit led to a dead end. In the climate of general indifference, stagnation, and despondency, the ocean Solaris was submerging under an ocean of printed paper. 2 years before I began the stint in Gibarian's laboratory, which ended when I obtained a diploma of the Institute, the Met Irving's Foundation afforded a huge prize. To anybody who could find a viable method of tapping the energy of the ocean. The idea was not a new one. Several cargoes of the plasmatic jelly had been shipped back to Earth in the past, and various methods of preservation have been patiently tested: high and low temperatures, artificial microatmospheres and microclimates, and prolonged irradiation. The whole gamut of physical and chemical processes have been run, only to end with the same outcome: a gradual process of decomposition which passed through well-defined stages, starting with wasting, maceration, then first degree, primary, and late secondary liquefaction. The samples removed from the plasmatic growths and creations met with the same fate, with certain variations of the phases of decomposition. The end product was always a light metallic ash. The end product was always a light metallic ash. Alright, I'm almost done with my break, so. Once the scientists recognized that it was impossible to keep alive or even in a vegetative state any fragment of the ocean, large or small, in disassociation from the entire organism, a growing tendency developed, under the influence of the Muir pro-Roach school, to isolate this problem as the key to the mystery. It was seen as a matter of interpretation. Solve it, and the back of the problem would be broken. The quest for this key, the philosopher's stone of Solaris studies, had absorbed the time and energy of all kinds of people with little or to no scientific training. During the 4th decade of Solaristics, the craze spread like an epidemic and provided a fertile ground for the psychologists. An unknown number of cranks and ignorant fanatics toiled at their fumbling researchers with a greater enthusiasm than any which had animated the old prophets of perpetual motion or the squaring of the circle. The craze fizzled out in only a few years, and by the time I was ready to leave for Solaris, I had vanished from the headlines and from conversation, and the ocean itself was practically forgotten by the public. I took care to replace the compendium in its correct alphabetical position, and in doing so, dislodged a slim pamphlet by Grasstrom, one of the most eccentric authors in Solaris literature. I had read the pamphlet, which was dictated to the urge to understand what lies beyond the grasp of mankind and aimed in particular against the individual man, the human species. It was the abstract, acidulous work of an autodidact who had previously made a series of unusual contributions to various marginal and rarefied branches of quantum physics. In the 15-page booklet, his magnus opus, Grasstrom set out to demonstrate that the most abstract achievements of science, the most advanced theories and victories of mathematics, represented nothing more than a stumbling or one-two progression from our rude, prehistoric, anthropomorphic understanding of the universe around us. He pointed out the correspondences with the human body, the projections of our senses, the structure of our physical organization, the physiological limitations of man, and the equations of the theory of relativity, the theorem of magnetic fields, and the various unified field theories. Grasstrom's conclusion was that there neither was nor could be any question of contact between mankind and any non-human civilization. This broadside against humanity made no specific mention of the living ocean, but its constant presence, and scornful, victorious silence could be felt between every line. At any rate, such had been my own impression. It was Giberian who drew it to my attention, and it must have been Giberian who had added it to the station's collection on his own authority, since Grasstrom's pamphlet was regarded more as a curiosity than a true contribution to Solaris literature. With a strange feeling, almost of respect, I carefully slid the slim pamphlet back into the crowded bookshelf, then stroked the green bronze binding of the Solaris manual with my fingertips. In the space of a few days, we had unquestionably gained positive information about a number of basic questions, which had made seas of ink flow and fed innumerable controversies, yet had remained sterile for lack of arguments. Today, the mystery practically had us under siege, and we had powerful arguments. I'm so tired, you got no clue. Was the ocean a living creature? It could hardly be doubted any longer by any but lovers of paradox or obstinacy. It was no longer possible to deny the psychic functions of the ocean, no matter how that term might be defined. Certainly it was only too obvious that the ocean had noticed us. This fact alone invalidated the category of Solaris theories, which claimed that the ocean was an introverted world, a hermit entity, deprived by a process of degeneration of the thinking organs it once possessed. Unaware of the existence of external objects and events, the pioneer of a gigantic vortex of mental currents created and confined in the depths of this monster, revolving between two suns. Not only that, we had discovered that the ocean was capable of reproducing what we ourselves had never succeeded in creating artificially. A perfect human body, modified in its subatomic structure for purposes we could not guess. I'm trying to finish the chapter. The ocean lived, thought, and acted. The Solaris problem had not been annihilated by its very absurdity. We were truly dealing with a living creature. The lost faculty was not lost at all. All this now seemed proved beyond doubt. Like it or not, men must pay attention to this neighbor. Light years away, but nevertheless a neighbor situated inside our sphere of expansion, and more disquieting than all the rest of the universe. Perhaps we had arrived at a turning point. What would the high-level decision be? Would we be ordered to give up and return to Earth immediately or in the near future? Was it even possible that we would be ordered to liquidate the station? It was at least not improbable, but I did not favor the solution by retreat. The existence of the thinking colossus was bound to go on haunting men's minds. Even when man had explored every corner of the cosmos and established relations with other civilizations founded by creatures similar to ourselves, Solaris would remain an external challenge. Damn, I'm so close. Misplaced among the thick volumes of the annual, I discovered a small calf-bound book and scanned its scuffed, worn cover for a moment. It was Montius's Introduction to Solaristics, published many years before. I had read it in a single night after Guibarian has smilingly lent me his personal copy, and when I had turned the final page, the light of a new Earth dawn was shining through my window. According to Montius, Solaristics is the space era's equivalent of religion, faith disguised as science. Contact, the stated aim of Solaristics, is no less vague and obscure than the communion of the saints or the second coming of the Messiah. Exploration is a liturgy using the language of methodology. The drudgery of the Solarists is carried out only in the expectation of fulfillment of an annunciation, for there are not and cannot be any bridges between Solaris and Earth. The comparison is reinforced by obvious parallels. Solaris reject arguments, no experiences in common, no communicable notions, just as the faithful rejected the arguments that undermine the foundations of their belief. Then again, what can mankind expect or hope for out of a joint pooling of information with the living ocean? A catalog of the vicissitudes as associated with an existence of such infinite duration that it probably has no memory of its origins. A description of the aspirations, passions, and sufferings that find expression in the perpetual creation of living mountains. The apotheosis of mathematics, the revelation of plenitude and isolation and renunciation. But all this represents a body of incommunicable knowledge. Transposed into any human language, the values and meanings involved lose all substance. They cannot be brought intact through the barrier. In any case, the adepts do not expect such revelations of the order of poetry rather than science, since unconsciously it is a revelation itself that they expect, and this revelation is to explain to them the meaning of the destiny of man. Solaristics is a revival of long-vanished myths, the expression of mystical nostalgias which men are unwilling to confess openly. The cornerstone is deeply entrenched in the foundations of the edifice. It is the hope of redemption. Solarists are incapable of recognizing this truth, and consequently take care to avoid any interruption of contact, which is presented in their writings as an ultimate goal, whereas originally had been considered as a beginning and as a step into a new path. among many other grading, and as a step onto a new path among many other possible paths. Over the years, contact has become sanctified. It has become the heaven of eternity. We're gonna stop there. I'm tired. I'm gonna take a little nap before I go to work. See you later.